It begins with words, not bullets. The Taliban rejects Donald Trump's demand to hand over Bagram Airbase, the sprawling military complex that once symbolized America's reach in Afghanistan. Their spokesman is blunt. Bagram is Afghan land. Not 1 inch will be surrendered. In Washington, Trump fires back, warning Kabul of bad things if the refusal continues. The world braces for rhetoric, but within hours, the rhetoric catches fire. 03:00 hours, Kabul time. A pair of U.S. Navy FA-18s, operating under NATO command, patrol the skies near the old Bagram corridor. It is meant to be a message, presence without intrusion, a reminder of American reach even after withdrawal. The jets roar low and steady, their silhouettes carved against the Afghan mountains. Then, without warning, tracer fire arcs upward. Anti-aircraft guns, dug into hillside positions, blaze into the night sky. Afghan gunners are not guessing, they are targeting. The pilots break formation, defensive flares streaking across the darkness. Radio chatter fills with shock. Taking fire, confirm hostile, multiple tracers, pulling evasive. For the first time since the chaotic withdrawal of 2021, American fighters are under live fire over Afghan soil. In Washington, reports slam into the Situation Room. Trump, defiant, paces behind the resolute desk, voice rising in fury. They shoot at our aircraft? After 20 years of us keeping order there? They'll see bad things all right. The Navy's top brass echo his outrage. To them, this is not just provocation, it is humiliation. The most powerful air force on Earth forced into defensive maneuvers by gunners who once fought with surplus weapons. Symbolically, it cuts deep. Russia, curiously, issues a restrained statement. Moscow calls for neutrality and warns both sides against escalation. For a moment, the world blinks in surprise. Russia, often eager to exploit America's stumbles, instead stands aside, watching. Analysts in Brussels whisper, the Kremlin sees opportunity in letting the US bleed alone. By dawn, the footage circulates online. Grainy cell phone videos show tracer lines clawing at the night sky, and American jets banking hard under fire. In Kabul, Taliban officials boast of defending sovereignty. In Washington, the Pentagon warns that rules of engagement are shifting. Escalation is no longer hypothetical. It is here. The first chapter of the new Bagram crisis is not about diplomacy. It is about firepower. And the world must decide whether this flash in the Afghan night is an isolated act of defiance, or the opening shot of something much larger. As 03:45 local, the tracer fire over Bagram becomes the fuse that lights a wider tinderbox. The pilots who drank the night air and saw orange sparks arch toward the stars carry the story into the cockpit debriefs, into carrier briefing rooms, and then, like wildfire, up the chain of command. The Navy's temper is short. Carrier strike groups compute response. Destroyers on station in the Arabian Sea move their yaw in readiness. Prowlers and growlers spin up their electronic suites. The message is clear without a press release. Posture, posture, posture. In the Situation Room, the tone is not calm. Telemetry from the jets is replayed at double speed. Intelligence overlays show the corridor from Kabul to Bagram, likely firing positions, the small villages cradling hillside emplacements. Legal advisors whisper about sovereignty, about the thin line between policing and attack. But politics is louder than law. President Trump, furious in public, pushes to make a headline operation. Not a cautious probe, but a demonstration. We can't be shot at, he says on camera. We'll respond, and they'll regret it. Navy commanders translate that into options. Shows of force, targeted strikes on anti-air emplacements, a demonstration of denial that stops short of full-scale invasion. Orders ripple out. An aircraft carrier repositions. Its deck a humming ant farm of pilots and ordnance. A destroyer slips to a closer bearing to provide radar and Tomahawk coverage. Special operations elements ready quick reaction packages for capture or targeted raids. Electronic warfare aircraft pre-stage over international waters, prepared to pummel local communications if commanded. The goal, commanders insist, is surgical pressure, to degrade capability, not to burn the country down. The risk, everyone concedes, is that surgical rarely looks surgical on the ground. Taliban spokesmen are defiant in public and careful in private. They parade the videos of tracer lines as proof that they will not bow. They tell domestic audiences that foreign jets will no longer dictate Afghan skies. But in closed channels there are calls to elders and to commanders. Avoid direct strikes on U.S. personnel unless ordered. Escalate in a focused way that wins hearts locally, rather than turn entire provinces into battlegrounds. The Taliban's calculus is brutal but pragmatic. Keep sovereignty intact. Avoid full confrontation that would invite overwhelming force, and seek diplomatic cover from patrons. Russia's posture remains oddly neutral, a cold observer on the sidelines. Kremlin spokesmen issue carefully balanced statements calling for restraint, while their intelligence networks quietly monitor U.S. movements. Moscow understands the upside of distance. Let Washington expend political capital and regional credibility. Then move in later to broker terms or expand influence. China, quiet but watchful, signals through back channels that it prefers regional stability, provided Beijing's interests are protected. As the first daylight leaks into Kabul, Washington opts for escalation below the threshold of all-out war. A strike plan is greenlit that aims to degrade radar arrays and heavy machine positions used to target aircraft. Night raids are ruled out for now. The political cost of civilian casualties is deemed too high. Instead, the Navy launches an unambiguous show. A low-altitude flyby of an Allied Hornet squadron along the corridor, visible to cameras and cell phones, paired with the destruction of several hardened emplacements by long-range missiles on remote ridgelines. Strikes scrubbed through legal channels and timed to minimize collateral damage. The public narrative is set. Measured, decisive, defensive. The Taliban screams betrayal. Provincial leaders rally fighters. Local militias, some long funded by anti-Taliban elements, begin skirmishes at roadblocks. Kabul's streets fill with nervous crowds and armed checkpoints. Aid groups warn of displaced civilians. Social feeds choke with clips. A missile launch from a ship at sea. A morning cloud column over a ridgeline. Children running down dusty alleys as men fire back from ruined bunkers. The optics are raw. The story no longer fits the neat moral boxes newsrooms prefer. Trump's rhetoric tightens the screws. Each televised threat ratchets pressure on commanders who must now balance political expectations with strategic prudence. The Navy's legal teams scrub every targeting package. Intelligence officers brief worst-case scenarios about blowback, about Pakistani or Iranian reactions if operations spill across borders. For every planned pinprick, planners simulate 10 paths of escalation. By dusk, the first round of limited strikes has been executed. Several anti-air positions suppressed, a handful of Taliban outposts damaged, but no decisive blow. The Taliban touts symbolic victories. A downed drone here, a captured Humvee there. The collision of theater and reality sharpens. The world watches as a theater of message and counter-message plays across desert and sea. A great power showing muscle, a local actor insisting on self-determination, and a regional chessboard suddenly rearranged. And beneath the military posturing, new dangers grow. A cycle of tit-for-tat that could pull in allies, proxies, or opportunists. Every missile fired, every jet scrambled, widens the fault lines. The question that keeps analysts awake is no longer whether the U.S. can coerce Bagram. It is whether coercion will become containment, and whether containment can be maintained without combusting into something far worse. 0310 local. The limited strikes did not calm the sky. They sharpened it. What began as a single night of tracer fire over Bagram blossoms into a day of mounting actions and frayed diplomacy. Washington's intent was clear: impose a cost without igniting a region-wide war. Reality, as always, is less tidy. By mid-morning, reports arrive that U.S. Special Operations teams have conducted a deniable raid outside the airbase perimeter, a fast-footed sweep to seize a weapons cache and capture 2 mid-level commanders alleged to have ordered the anti-air ambush. The raid is surgical on paper. Helicopters in, men on the ground, a rapid exfil. On the screens back home it looks different. grainy night vision footage, the flash of muzzle signatures, a survivor dragged into a Black Hawk. Kabul explodes in outrage. The Taliban calls it an act of blatant aggression. Crowds gather at checkpoints, slogans rise, and local commanders vow reprisal. In parallel, a wave of cyber incidents ripples across the region. Afghan ministry servers slow to a crawl, phone networks suffer targeted outages, and local television stations lose broadcast feeds for blocks of time. U.S. officials point fingers subtly toward pro-Taliban hacking cells and shady third-party groups exploiting the chaos. Taliban spokesmen deny responsibility for global outages, but celebrate local disruptions that erode coordination. Whatever the authors, the effect is the same: confusion, suspicion, and paralysis in institutions already weak. Moscow watches the smoke of drones and missiles from a distance, maintaining the neutral posture it declared at first. Kremlin analysts, however, are anything but idle. Russian intelligence quietly sends envoys to regional players, probing for openings. In Tehran, hardliners cheer Washington's entanglement. In Islamabad, military planners frown at the instability on their western flank. China urges restraint in public, but behind closed doors it presses both Kabul and Washington for assurances, and for economic influence that can replace American leverage should U.S. pressure falter. At sea, carrier strike groups maintain a menacing orbit. Decks buzz with sorties, though rules of engagement are tightened to avoid another diplomatic catastrophe. Drones, reconnaissance and armed, prowl corridors between the Arabian Sea and the Hindu Kush, feeding commanders a steady leak of imagery that will be shaped into talking points and intelligence memos. Every sortie photographed by locals is a piece of narrative. Every intercepted transmission is ammunition for both hawks and doves in capitals. The political theater intensifies. President Trump, engaged and televised, ratchets rhetoric into a drumbeat, threats of sanctions, declarations that the U.S. will not tolerate attacks on its aircraft, and veiled promises of further measures if Bagram is not returned to American oversight. Congressional voices split predictably, some calling for decisive pressure, others warning against mission creep. NATO allies murmur support, but urge de-escalation. Few want boots back on the ground. The message from Brussels is cautious: solidarity, but restraint. On the ground, Taliban commanders balance street-level bravado with cold arithmetic. They authorize strikes that are dramatic yet deniable. Mortars aimed at supply convoys some kilometers from Bagram, remote IEDs that halt logistics, and orchestrated protests that clog supply lines. Each act is calibrated to show strength without inviting an overwhelming counterstrike. Yet calibration is an imperfect art. Grief and rage on the streets can push a local commander to overreach, and overreach breeds response. Then an incident changes the calculus. A pickup, filled with contractors working for a logistics firm tied to U.S. supply chains, detonates a roadside bomb. Casualty reports flow in. Contractors dead, convoys halted, a humanitarian NGO pulling personnel out of nearby provinces. The optics are catastrophic. In Washington, the images are a blow to the argument for waiting. Hawks demand immediate crippling action. Diplomats plead for a pause to avoid regional conflagration. Regional actors react predictably and unpredictably. Pakistan's military, keenly aware of border spillover risk, tightens checkpoints and whispers to Washington through back channels about the dangers of unchecked strikes. Iran leverages the moment to push proxies into more aggressive postures. Russia, ever pragmatic, floats the idea of a mediated dialogue, a staged negotiation where Moscow can position itself as power broker, while the U.S. pays the political price for a new Afghan reality. By evening, the crisis has moved far from a single act of fire at night. It has become a braided crisis: kinetic raids, cyber disruption, diplomatic posturing, proxy maneuvers, and economic threats. The Taliban posture that began as a declaration of sovereignty now carries collateral consequences no one fully intended. Washington's insistence on deterrence collides with the region's fragile seams. The question is no longer whether Bagram will be returned. It is whether any party can contain the spiraling reactions that have already been set in motion. 040 local. The spiral tightens. What began with tracer fire and limited strikes has grown into a crisis bleeding across borders. The Taliban's defiance hardens after the raid and cyber chaos. American pressure intensifies, yet clarity slips further away with every new incident. On the deck of a U.S. carrier in the Arabian Sea, flight operations blur into a near-constant cycle. Reconnaissance drones stream back footage of armed convoys gathering near Bagram. Analysts interpret it as preparation, a preemptive show of strength. Trump's advisors debate what to do with the intel. Some argue for immediate suppression, destroy the convoys before they disperse into villages. Others warn that striking so openly risks a massacre with cameras rolling. The president leans toward action. "They fire on our jets," he says on live television. "They move weapons to threaten us. We will respond." By late morning, the decision is made. A precision strike package is cleared. A limited number of missiles, targeted at convoy vehicles staged in clear terrain. At 11:20 local time, explosions ripple across the valley floor. Afghan spokesmen release images within minutes: twisted steel, dust clouds, men digging survivors from rubble. The Taliban narrative spreads fast. America has bombed Afghans on Afghan soil once again. Protests ignite in Kabul and Kandahar. Crowds spill into the streets, chanting against foreign interference, waving black and white flags. In one clip, armed men climb onto the walls of a burned-out checkpoint, firing rifles in the air as civilians shout support. The message is clear: every strike fuels the claim of resistance. International reaction fractures. NATO allies, blindsided, express concern over escalation without consultation. Russia, still officially neutral, seizes the moment to call for an emergency UN session, presenting itself as a guardian of sovereignty. China echoes the call, hinting at regional stabilization efforts where Beijing, not Washington, would hold the reins. Inside the Pentagon, mood swings between frustration and grim determination. Commanders insist the strikes were measured, that collateral damage was minimized. But intelligence reports warn that Taliban fighters are reinforcing positions around Bagram and dispersing anti-air assets deeper into mountain passes. The risk of another direct attack on U.S. aircraft has grown, not diminished. As evening falls, a chilling incident underscores the danger. A U.S. surveillance drone, orbiting the perimeter of Afghan airspace, suddenly loses signal. Minutes later, Taliban channels claim responsibility, parading fragments of a wrecked fuselage on social media. The footage is shaky but convincing. Jubilant fighters pose with the debris, declaring it proof that foreign eyes can be blinded. Washington explodes in anger. The Navy demands freedom to neutralize any anti-air network near Bagram. Trump, incandescent, calls the downing an attack on America itself. The rhetoric leaps ahead of strategy. The line between deterrence and war blurs further. In Kabul, Taliban leaders balance triumph with calculation. They know the U.S. has the firepower to level provinces. But they also know Washington's appetite for a prolonged Afghan campaign has soured with the public. Their gamble is that defiance will outlast outrage. Each downed drone, each fiery protest, each video of resistance builds their narrative. By midnight, analysts across the globe admit what leaders won't. The confrontation has entered an escalation ladder with fewer rungs left. Every step up narrows choices. Every action shrinks the space for retreat. Bagram is no longer just a base. It has become a symbol, a fault line between American pride and Afghan sovereignty. And symbols, once blood has been shed, are never surrendered easily. 06:15 local. The dust from the last strikes still hangs in the valleys, and the images of burning convoys and downed drones have sprouted 1,000 narratives across the world. In living rooms and government war rooms alike, people ask the same terrible question: where does this end? In Washington, the answer is at once simple and impossible. The president demands answers and visible results. The Pentagon lists options and risks. Lawmakers who once shouted for toughness now squabble over a pending language that limits mission creep. NATO capitals, meanwhile, are fracturing along familiar lines. Some members demand a unified front, clear condemnation of the attacks, support for punitive measures, and joint pressure to secure Bagram. Others, scarred by the cost of past interventions and eager to avoid being pulled into another regional quagmire, counsel restraint. The alliance that once rallied in a single voice now speaks in tones of discord. Moscow smells opportunity. Officially, the Kremlin maintains a posture of measured neutrality and calls for diplomacy. Unofficially, Russian influence grows. Russian envoys move quietly through Islamabad and Kabul, offering to mediate ceasefires while expanding security ties with local commanders. Russian contractors and intelligence advisors, deniable, shadowy, begin to show up where U.S. partners once stood. For Moscow, the path is strategic: erode American influence, build dependency, and present Russia as the practical alternative to chaotic U.S. pressure. Beijing plays a subtler hand. China publicly urges calm and respect for sovereignty, and privately offers economic packages to Kabul's rulers: infrastructure investments, port access, and long-term loans that come without lectures on governance. The message is transactional: side with us, and gain stability and investment; resist, and face isolation. For Afghanistan's leaders, who have always balanced on the edge of patronage, the calculus is immediate. Survival may now mean pivoting east. Inside Afghanistan, the human picture is raw. Markets empty, roads clogged with refugees and aid convoys diverted or delayed. Tribal elders and local commanders bargain for advantage. Some accept Chinese cash and Russian hardware. Others promise to keep choke points calm for a price. The old networks of patronage, the invisible circulatory system that once carried influence across the country, reconfigure themselves, and the people in the middle bear the cost. Children miss school. Clinics run low on supplies. A generation grows up amid slogans and sirens. Back in Allied capitals, the debate hardens into a policy fork. One path calls for doubling down, a multinational stabilization force, strict targeting of anti-air capabilities, and a diplomatic push to isolate patron states helping the Taliban. It promises clarity of purpose but risks widening the war and acting on an assumption of political will that may not exist. The other path urges an exit from kinetic answers: massive investment in regional diplomacy, sanctions and economic pressure, covert support for local actors who can keep supply lines safe, a strategy built on patient containment rather than decisive blows. It promises control without victory. Neither choice is clean. Any move toward large-scale operations risks turning a brittle insurgency into a sprawling theater of conflict that draws in Pakistan, Iran, or proxies aligned with Moscow and Beijing. Any decision to back away risks emboldening actors who will test the limits again and again. The fog of small wins and public outrage obscures the long view. Durable stability in Afghanistan is not won from the air alone. It is won by institutions, by governance, by predictable livelihoods, things bullets and missiles cannot build. In the aftermath, the story the world remembers is symbolic. A U.S. carrier's jets forced into evasive maneuvers over Afghan mountains. A drone tumbled from the sky, a convoy shredded, and a global poker table rearranged. The practical legacy will be slower and more consequential. A diminished American footprint, emboldened regional powers, and an Afghanistan whose future is negotiated between patrons rather than chosen by its people. And yet, even as diplomats trade threats and offers in quiet rooms, one stubborn truth persists: symbols matter. Bagram was never only soil or hangars, it was a visible emblem of influence. The Taliban's refusal to hand it over changed perceptions. The tracer fire that night changed behavior. The strikes and counterstrikes changed alignments. As the sun sets on this chapter, the final question is not which bomb fell where or which convoy burned. It is this: will the world let Bagram become a precedent, a place where great power rivalry is played out on the backs of a fragile nation? Or will it force a different path, one where Afghan sovereignty is honored, while violence is contained by collective, principled diplomacy? If you had to choose one path, forceful containment through military means, or a long diplomatic gamble that cedes immediate control in hopes of future stability, which would you pick?